Hello, good evening everyone. I would like to invite you to come a bit further up the hall. طيب ħafna. Just to let you know, this event is being also streamed live, and there are a number of participants who are following this event both locally but also from other countries in our network. I would like to welcome you to this event, Building Peace Amid the Rubble of War. Unfortunately, war is once again being waged on European soil, leaving our hearts troubled and our eyes incredulous. In the words of Pope Francis, we are seeing all too much blood, all too much violence. Thousands have already lost their lives, and apart from the direct casualties of war, the humanitarian situation is desperate. Since the war started, 11 million Ukrainians out of a population of 44 million have been forced to leave their homes. The situation in Ukraine perhaps hits closer to home, but it is not a novelty. In fact, by the end of last year, more than 84 million people had been forcibly displaced from their home. On the UNHCR website, there are 13 countries or regions listed as emergencies, apart from Ukraine. In fact, for years now, Pope Francis has been warning us that the situations of violence have become so common as to constitute a real Third World War fought piecemeal. Ever mindful of forgotten conflicts, this Easter Sunday Pope Francis prayed for peace in the Middle East, wrecked by years of conflict and division, for the peoples of Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, for Libya so that it may find stability after years of tensions, for Yemen, which suffers from a conflict forgotten by all, for Myanmar, where a dramatic scenario of hatred and violence persists, for Afghanistan, where dangerous social tensions are not easing and a tragic humanitarian crisis is bringing suffering to its people, and for the entire African continent, particularly in the Sahel region, Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Confronted by this dramatic scenario, as Christians and as Catholics, we cannot shirk away from our responsibility to ask some uncomfortable questions. In times of war, what does it mean to love your enemy? How do phrases such as "never again war" help us navigate the ethical dilemmas of real-life politics? It is easy to be a pacifist sitting peacefully in a meeting hall such as this one. But how true is this for those under aggression? Last autumn, when addressing a St. Egidio peace meeting in Rome, Pope Francis invited us not to be indifferent onlookers when faced with violent conflict. On the contrary, he said, we need to empathize with those who share our humanity. There lies the inevitable ambivalence of Catholic moral tradition when it comes to war. What does empathy for the people of Ukraine mean in these concrete circumstances? How can we reconcile a near total opposition to war, including on the basis of the traditional criteria used to justify a just war, as in Fratelli Tutti, with the duty to seek ways to make the oppressor cease his oppression and strip him of a power he does not know how to use? Without pretending to give definite answers to these thorny questions, the Justice and Peace Commission organized this event with the aim of offering a space of reflection and discussion on this theme. With the help of Father René Micallef, we hope to shed some light on the different ethical aspects which have to be kept in mind in conflicts such as the one in Ukraine. We were also supposed to have Ms. Claudia Taylor-East from SOS Malta to bring us testimonies of those who are currently suffering in the madness of war. However, unfortunately, she couldn't join us today due to an emergency. I therefore invite Father René Micallef to give us his talk. Father René is a Maltese Jesuit priest and associate professor in moral theology and social ethics at the Pontifical Gregorian University. He specializes in topics such as migration, conflict, human rights, and the sources of moral reasoning. Father Micallef holds an undergraduate degree in biology and chemistry from the University of Malta and graduate degrees in philosophy, University of London, theology, Faculté Jésuite de Paris, in the Università Pontificia de Comillas de Madrid. His doctoral work in sacred theology, defended at Boston College, focused on the ethics of migration policies. Father René, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So, hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you this evening. Also, those who are following us online, very welcome to join us. Protecting peace among the rubble of war. So you started with Fratelli Tutti and Pope Francis. Let us go and look at the text, which is number 258 of the encyclical Fratelli Tutti. War can easily be chosen by invoking all sorts of allegedly humanitarian, defensive, or precautionary excuses, and even resorting to the manipulation of information. In recent decades, every single war has been ostensibly justified. The Catechism of the Catholic Church speaks of the possibility of legitimate defense by means of military force, which involves demonstrating that certain rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy have been met. Yet it is easy to fall into an overly broad interpretation of this potential right, so laxism. In this way, some would also wrongly justify even preventive attacks, so preemptive, we would say, technically, or acts of war that can hardly avoid entailing evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. At issue is whether the development of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and the enormous and growing possibilities offered by new technologies, we have lasers in space now, we have hypersonic missiles, we have all sorts of technology to destroy electricity grids and cyber warfare. Whether all of this have granted war an uncontrollable destructive power over great numbers of innocent civilians, the truth is that never has humanity had such power over itself, yet nothing ensures that it will be used wisely. With great power comes great responsibility, but also great corruptibility, maybe also. So we can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably be always greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of just war. Never again war. I mean, this is a prophetical text. I'm not here to defend the Pope's position on this, but rather I'd like to bring something else from Francis to the table. Francis does not simply do away with traditional prudence, which means dealing with complexity as regards conflict, but also he feels he should be a radical prophetic voice on the world stage as regards to war today. We will see a bit this debate. It has a certain level of complexity, which I'll try to touch upon. So one of the problems is, what does war mean? I mean, we think we know what war means, but obviously when you read some of the military texts and some of the difficult complex philosophical debates, especially after the Vietnam War and after the fall of the Soviet Union, the meaning of the word war is not so clear. It means many things, and often not exactly what we have in mind. So can we reappraise and apply traditional teaching to today's wars? Or should we abandon traditional teaching? Certainly, the Church doesn't easily abandon traditional teaching. There is wisdom of many centuries. The Church was very radically pacifist in its first centuries. Then it had to deal already with Augustine, especially when the Roman Empire made Christianity a state religion, there was a moment where Christians couldn't become soldiers and couldn't engage in war. But then, I mean, they had this attitude that given when the Roman Empire was at peace, they assumed that they could become soldiers and never use violence. But then, at some point, Rome was no longer at peace, and the Christians had to defend Rome. So the whole debate on the legitimate use of violence came out. And we've been reflecting on this for many centuries. What do we do with all of this teaching today? Interestingly, I mean, part of the history revolves about a movement which starts in France at around the year 1000, called the Peace of God and the Truth of God movement. We had loads of war, especially in the south of France and some parts of the Mediterranean, who wreaked havoc, destroying ecclesiastical properties, destroying farm properties, killing civilians and priests. And I mean, part of the solution was creative, that they started to put some limits on what you can do when you're fighting. This was very pragmatic. It was also symbolic, so they got these lords of war to swear on sacred relics and to participate in very solemn processions in order to get them to obey, to observe these minimal rules of engagement. Also, there was a movement called the Truth of God, which tried to limit the time for warfare to as limited a time as possible. So you couldn't wage war in special feasts. You couldn't wage war during Lent, so I mean, the idea was when Western Christianity had one calendar to try to limit days when soldiers could wield weapons. This eventually became, I mean, it became what we call, maybe with a misnomer, the just war theory. We'll go and look at it quickly, but just to wrap up the first part of my argument, Francis' ethics, if we look at his ethics as a whole, when you read Laudato Si, when you read the way he talks about marriage and divorced and remarried couples, when he talks about so many issues, he tends towards discernment, towards prudence and complexity, recognizing that life cannot be easily and neatly reduced to simple norms. Certainly, we know that there's a fifth commandment, do not kill. It doesn't say do not kill innocent people, it says do not kill. It doesn't say do not kill people, it says do not kill, not even animals. So, I mean, we can live that very radically. I mean, we can be completely vegan if we want. But we've always interpreted, even within, there are passages from the Old Testament which speak about ritual genocide. God orders them to kill everything. Women, children, even the beasts, even the livestock had to be destroyed. And when Israel didn't completely annihilate its enemy, God punished Israel because they did their genocide only halfway. I mean, probably these genocides never happened historically, but I mean, it's interesting that there are different voices in gospel. If you listened to the Passion narratives last week, we have the Passion narrative from the Synoptic Gospels on Palm Sunday, which shows us a Jesus who is meek and who simply leaves himself to be carried through the Passion as a lamb who doesn't pose any resistance to its captors. And also, but we have the Gospel according to John on Good Friday, where Jesus is completely in control all the time. And again, it's not because he lacks power that he is suffering. It's because he chooses not to use his power. he can just destroy all of them by blinking an eye. I mean, he has the nuclear option, which he simply decides not to use. So this is, again, when we deal with the complexity of Scripture. Just a little citation from Francis. We need to form future priests. This was in 2016 to the Polish Jesuits. We need to form future priests not to general and abstract ideas which are clear and distinct. This is Descartes, Cartesian kind of thinking, but to this keen discernment of spirits so that they can help people in their concrete life. We need to truly understand this. In life, not all is black on white or white on black. No, the shades of gray prevail in life. We must teach them, future priests, and obviously also our laity, to discern this gray area. Certainly, Francis has baggage in dealing with issues of war. Besides his own studies, again, which focus also on authors like Guardini, written in a period where there is this hysteria about nuclear annihilation of Germany. He has personal history in dealing with the Argentinian generals, the dirty wars, so-called wars on the Marxists, which included some of the Jesuits who were considered Marxists. Then the way that when things started to go badly for the Argentinian generals, they invented the Falklands War or the Malvinas invasion, and to distract people. And then also he had to deal in various capacities with the effects of the US hemispheric defense doctrine, which is the successor of the Monroe Doctrine, Kissingerism, and more recently neocon attitude to war, so to spread democracy and so on. So he has a very skeptical approach given to his personal history. Let's go to look at it a bit at the tradition which are we referring to. So the tradition has two sort of two parts. Today we have, I mean, it's more complex in some of the philosophical debates. There is what we call jus ad vim, which is use of force short of war, short of physical violence. For example, sanctions regimes or other diplomatic moves. We also have to think about what happens after the war. So jus post bellum and what we call transitional justice. But like the traditional debates focus on jus ad bellum. So what would be a legitimate reason, condition to get involved in a conflict? And during the conflict, what would allow you to legitimately continue fighting? I mean, there are moments where you may get into a war, a conflict, for the right reasons, but at some point, there's no way of fighting that conflict in a way which is not dirty. At which point, here, just war theory conflates with pacifism. If you can't fight clean, then you have to accept defeat, even if you may have all of the right reasons to fight, to continue to fight. So traditionally, I mean, it may look lax, and it has been used to justify all sorts of wars going back even to the Renaissance and early modernity. So the focus is on these 5 criteria. So having a just cause objectively, obviously the honest intention of the person making the decision. This is not something traditionally which could be appraised from the outside, but it's something which you could discuss with your confessor or your spiritual father. I mean, today there are new reinterpretations of what honest intention means in a prime minister's consult, trying to see, okay, they may have a just cause, but actually they're using that just cause for some other dishonest intention. I mean, for example, to exploit the resources or to weaken an enemy to a point that then they can exploit they can destabilize that other country. Okay, violence is seen as a last resort. Again, what last resort means is a delicate issue, because obviously if it's so very, very last, we may never actually end up protecting any innocent people left. Decision by a legitimate authority, and here the word decision also is important, because there has to be a declaration of war, and there has to be a declaration of a cause of war. The problem with the Russian-Ukrainian war is that Russia says there's no war. It's never declared, not even in 2014 did it declare a war on Ukraine. So we don't know why they're fighting, and we cannot appraise it from a jus ad bellum perspective. I mean, we'll try to give some possible answers to that. Proportionate response to the triggering act. I mean, you cannot use nuclear, obviously, in response to conventional warfare, but overwhelm the person, with your technology and with your military might. Today we would add a real probability of success, and even if, I mean, you're right, but if there's no probability of success, why would you sacrifice your people? And physical violence should only be used defensively. Now, the distinction I'm making is that before a certain period in modernity, physical violence was, a lot of our conception of ethics depended on a conception of honor, and sometimes honor was more important than life. So the idea that a verbal abuse, a verbal offense to honor might warrant a physical response, that was very common in the past, and in some cultures it's still very common. I mean, you just think of what happened during the Oscars this year. So, you know, the idea that certain offenses to honor need physical punishment is still quite common in our societies. Traditionally, a person could aggress another for lèse-majesté, for other reasons. That has been removed, at least in international law and in Catholic theory today. So only physical violence can only be used defensively. But not everybody accepts that in real fact. All right, jus in bello, the importance of the ability to distinguish non-combatants from combatants, so the principle of discrimination, and to ensure non-combatant immunity. The ability to ensure proportionality of the response to the individual operations of war. Again, what kind of technology can we transfer to Ukraine? I mean, but again, the question is, there are certain things which are not allowed because they're not proportionate. The ability to attribute decisions and actions so as to allow for post-bellum accountability for crimes. This is something which is added more from a legal point of view today. So, I mean, if the war becomes so much of a total war, at least where it's not clear where the line of command is and who is responsible for what, then we have a problem, because then, okay, who is responsible for what? Can you do something? Can you do a post-war reconstruction of the tissue of society? So can you do any restorative justice after war and any retributive justice after war if it becomes so decentralized? So these are some of the traditional constraints, if you want, which obviously come from Catholic tradition. So some of these ideas come from Augustine, some from this movement which I mentioned, which interprets Augustine, so the peace of God and the truth of God movement. in the 11th century, and then we have some of the writings of Aquinas, then we have writings by Francisco de Vitoria and by Francisco Suarez in the second period, I mean Salamanca Thomism. So that obviously moved into mainstream, eventually legal practice, but had to be revived by the humanitarian movement, especially after Solferino and with Henri Dunant and so on, and then the Geneva Convention. The second thing I mentioned is the polysemy. What do we mean by the word war? Certainly, we still tend to think of conventional modern wars. I will say that the current war in the Ukraine is maybe a pseudo-conventional modern war. It looks very much like a modern war, like a conventional modern war. Certainly, if you, going back to the text from Fratelli Tutti, there's a reference to weapons of mass destruction, atomic, biological, and chemical wars, ABC wars, which we can add maybe new technologies to some extent. I mean, there's been a debate this morning, this afternoon in the New York Times regarding the use of cluster weapons. We had a convention in 2010 banning the use of cluster weapons. Ukraine and Russia didn't sign that convention. Sure, it seems that Ukraine used them too against Russian soldiers. I mean, it hasn't used them against civilians as far as we know, but I mean, that's concerning because there is also a way of treating soldiers which is unacceptable. And it can also concern what, cluster bombs, have been around since time immemorial. Napoleon used his own form of cluster bombs and so on. And then the third thing is what Mary Kaldor calls the new war. So let's just go and look at these three types of war. The first meaning is a conventional industrial war, a battle in a field between men and machinery. This is what General Rupert Smith calls this kind of warfare in his book Utility of Force, 2005. And I think some of our debates still think of wars like the World War II, because that's how we imagine war. However, as General Smith says, he was in charge of the operations in Bosnia and Kosovo, if I'm not mistaken. Such war no longer exists. Some may say, well, maybe this war is going back to some of that, not completely, but in part. So maybe, but. So that's one thing to keep in mind. What he says that there are modern wars are different, and he uses the term war amongst the people. What Mary Kaldor uses the term new wars. We'll see what that means. Let's move to meaning 2, which is strategic and theater level use of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. This is excluded by Jus in Bellum. There is debate on tactical level use. If you can have a nuclear weapon so precise that it only destroys a column of tanks. Actually, current systems are almost certainly unacceptable also because of the ecological damage and the long-term damage so even the smallest of nuclear ordinances are almost completely excluded by traditional. However, there is a use of these weapons for deterrence. It is the bluff kind of thing. If I have them, I might use them, so you better think twice. There has been a big debate on this in 1983, especially due to a change in the strategy of the USSR to move, the Euro missiles crisis in 1983. Certainly, the American bishops wanted a position much more rigorous than that of Reagan. Reagan and John Paul II, I mean, Reagan did a blitz on the Vatican and convinced John Paul II that he needed to rearm in order to start to convince the Soviet Union to disarm. So John Paul II said, well, okay, I mean, there's a limit to what an arms race which you can do, but deterrence is acceptable if it is subject to a desire and a plan to start a reciprocal arms reduction commitment. So, in as far as your enemy is ready to start an arms reduction procedure, you might consider keeping, in the meanwhile, some of the arms for deterrence. Certainly, the amount of nuclear weapons which has been accumulated by the former Soviet Union and the USA destroyed the world many times over. I've attended briefings at the Vatican with some of the guys from the Obama administration who are trying to explain their efforts to modernize, and that Russia criticized this as a sort of, you know, yeah, you're making them better, but he said they're in such a decrepit state in some places that they're a danger, and there's a whole debate in the United States because some of the nuclear waste, they haven't decided where to store it, and they haven't started to move it to Arizona, where they had found a safe place to keep some of these spent nuclear fissile material. So obviously in the ex-USSR and some other countries, the state of some of these nuclear weapons can be dismal at times, and I mean, it's a big danger for humanity, and that's another debate for us. Okay. Let's see a little bit this deterrent argument. I mean, in 1993, a guy called John Mearsheimer made a case in Foreign Policy Journal for a Ukrainian nuclear deterrent. So he says, after Chernobyl, most Western observers want Ukraine to rid itself of nuclear weapons as quickly as possible. In this view, articulated recently by President Bill Clinton, Europe would be more stable if Russia were to become the only nuclear-armed successor state to the Soviet Union. Clinton is wrong. A nuclear Ukraine is imperative to maintain peace between Russia and Ukraine. This means that Russians, who have a history of bad relations with Ukraine, do not move to reconquer it. Ukraine cannot defend itself against a nuclear-armed Russia with conventional weapons, and no state, including the US, is going to extend to it a meaningful security guarantee. I mean, this was obvious also in the Bucharest summit in 2008, where basically NATO says, well, you cannot really join us. We can offer you a possibility of joining in the future. The case presented here for Ukrainian nuclear deterrent is not a brief for unrestricted nuclear proliferation in Europe or anywhere else. Widespread proliferation would increase the number of fingers on the nuclear trigger, which would in turn increase the likelihood that nuclear weapons could be fired due to accident, unauthorized use, terrorist seizure, or rational decision-making. Nevertheless, nuclear proliferation sometimes promotes peace. A war between Russia and Ukraine would be a disaster. Great power wars are very costly and dangerous, causing massive loss of life and worldwide turmoil, and possibly spreading to involve other countries. Interestingly, in response, another realist thinker, Samuel Huntington, in 1996 says this in his famous book, The Clash of Civilizations: a statist paradigm leads, so looking at the world as made of nation states, leads John Mearsheimer to predict the situation between Ukraine and Russia is ripe for the outbreak of security competition between them. Instead, a civilization approach, the one which Huntington is proposing, emphasizes the close cultural, personal, and historical links between Russia and Ukraine, and the intermingling of Russians and Ukrainians in both countries, and focuses instead on the civilization fault line that divides Orthodox Eastern Ukraine from Uniate Western Ukraine, a central historical fact which, given his statism, Mersheimer totally ignores. While a statist approach highlights the possibility of Russian-Ukrainian war, a civilizational approach minimizes that and instead highlights the possibility of Ukraine splitting in half. So a civil war in Ukraine, more violent than the split in Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, but less bloody than that in Yugoslavia. So basically, I mean, Huntington in some way is more towards this idea that Ukraine will split in two by itself. Okay, let's see the third paradigm, the new wars, or the war amongst the people. So this is the principal meaning of the term war in the 21st century to date. In a report from 2011, the World Bank says the global systems of the 20th century were designed to address interstate tensions and civil wars. War between nation states and civil war have a given logic. 21st century violence does not fit the 20th century mold. Violence and conflict have not been banished, but because of success in reducing interstate war, the remaining forms of violence do not fit neatly either into the war or peace or into political or criminal violence. In her article, in defense of the term new wars, what do we call these wars? I mean, conflict, open conflict, jihad, and jihad-like wars, criminal violence disguised as warfare. There are a lot of terminology, postmodern wars, whatever. So the actors in old wars before the 1980s, let's say, were regular armed forces of states, whereas in the new wars, state and non-state actors are involved, jihadists, security contractors, and so on. The goals, on one hand, geopolitical interest and ideology, Marxism, democracy, so on. The other, we have different forms of understandings of identity, ethnic, religious, tribal. The methods, the old wars used a decisive encounter with a military capture of territory, whereas the new wars use the control of population, which means a political capture of territory, sometimes by terrorizing the population into submission or removing the population by population displacement. The finance, on one hand, is centralized taxation and foreign, borrowing money for warfare and then foreign state support, whereas the new wars have a decentralized form of financing with predatory private finance, criminal activities, including narcotics and kidnappings and so on, diaspora funding, and secret support from hush-hush help from other governments. It's difficult to distinguish. Sometimes the wars are waged by a sort of coalition of two types of groups. There are people with an identitarian dream who use criminal financing to support their conflict, and there are actual criminals who disguise their criminal empire, their operations to extract minerals and to grow and distribute narcotics using an identitarian shell in order to avoid accountability from a formal government. So we have even frozen conflicts where normal jurisprudence cannot go in and deal with some of the criminality involved. This is a map which can be helpful. The dark red here, almost brown, are major wars with 10,000 or more deaths in the current or past calendar year. But we have wars with 1,000 to 9,999 deaths in the past calendar year, which are in red. And then minor conflicts in orange and in yellow, skirmishes and other conflicts. So we are in a world at war. It's important not to forget this, because we may think that the only important conflict is Ukraine, but there are a lot of a lot of other conflicts going on, and I think an important exercise is to take a look at this map and see, can I say one sentence about the other places, at least in red? What do I know about these conflicts? Certainly never again war, but never again genocide. I've been to Rwanda, I've been to Dachau, I've been to Bosnia, I've been to the torture chambers of Idi Amin in Uganda and Mengistu in Ethiopia. I've met Yemeni refugees in Addis Ababa. I've worked with South Sudanese refugees in Uganda. And certainly, that's something which, for me, is important, that we can prevent this kind of thing from happening. So one of the ways of reflecting on this is to speak of just international policing. The new war scenario, where there's this mixture of criminal and identity warfare, well, it's tolerated when it's low level or too costly for NATO to intervene. Actually, why not NATO? Because the word United Nations is not a world government and it must respect sovereignty. But in the case of mass atrocities, it seems that only NATO and sometimes other countries, but around the core of NATO countries, intervene on behalf of the United Nations to stop the aggressor. I mean, that's been the case in these last decades. Not always in the most intelligent, gratuitous, and morally laudable of ways. They've done a lot of bad things also in these so-called, in some cases, humanitarian interventions. But we cannot simply say that because some of these things were done not in the right way, we shouldn't have anyone intervene. So Catholic and humanitarian conflict limitation theory has thus morphed into a just international policing theory in some theorists, especially after Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and other places. In the UN, the principle of the responsibility to protect was developed and approved by the General Assembly in 2005. So basically, the idea is that state sovereignty is not just a privilege, but it's also a responsibility. It implies that the states have an obligation to protect their citizens and residents from mass atrocities. Certainly, not all have the means, and the international community should assist states in fulfilling this obligation. However, if a state is not able and not willing to act appropriately to protect people from mass atrocities, the responsibility to protect, using diplomatic, humanitarian, but also military means, if necessary, falls to that larger community of states. Responsibility to protect should be understood as a solemn promise of defense made by humanity to all its members endangered by mass atrocities wherever. In some way, we can say that state sovereignty is trumped until the aggression ceases and other states can send their armies to keep people from committing genocide and mass and grave human rights violations. Obviously, this is very tricky. Again, how to interpret this within the UN Charter there's a lot of debate on this. Interventions are seen here as defensive wars. I mean, yes, you invade a country. If there's a genocide in Rwanda, it means invading Rwanda in some way. But you're defending the population against the state, which is already causing an aggression on its own people, or allowing armed groups to freely kill and massacre its own population. So this is one way of understanding it. It is also understood as an act of international policing in failed states. There's no police to keep people from killing people unjustly, so I mean, we should do something. Again, lots of complex moral issues and legal issues here, but this is some of the debate. How can we replace this current war which we have in Ukraine? Is it a war to maintain a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe? I don't think that would be economically affordable, certainly not morally acceptable. It would be a sort of a Russian Monroe Doctrine. You don't get to touch my sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Certainly, every sovereign country has a right to join the alliances it wants. Malta can change its constitution, and it has a right to build a Russian or Chinese base if it so desires, even though it has a history of collaboration with NATO, and a lot of its neighbors won't be happy, but that's what sovereignty means. If Russia cannot keep its neighbors from joining its enemies, then that's Russia's diplomatic failure. Ideological war or jihad, orthodox jihad against Western permissivism. Unfortunately, the Patriarch Kirill used this kind of language and reasoning. Certainly, crusades and holy wars are not physically defensive and hence not morally acceptable in the 21st century. I mean, this is not a credible aim, politically and economically also for Russia to pursue. Is it a romanticist war to unite or liberate the Russian ethnic nation? I mean, this however, doesn't make any sense in a multi-ethnic, globalized world. Interesting to note that Kievan Rus was the birthplace of Russian nation. Ukrainians are ethnically Russian. I mean, we make the distinction today, but this is, we can debate, but certainly Sicilians and Tuscans have different forms of Italian, and obviously Sardinians speak a different kind of Romance language than Italian, but I mean, they're Italian. It depends on how you look at what Italy means. Even in Russia, which is a continent, there are many ethnicities and many languages. Certainly Russia was very angry when the Chechens wanted self-determination and stamped that out completely. So this kind of reasoning is completely out of place today, I think. Ukrainians are ethnically Russian if you want, but they've chosen to live in a nation state which is not ruled from Moscow and does not depend on the Kremlin for its government. Just policing to defend ethnic Russians in Donetsk, Luhansk from mass atrocities. I mean, this is morally and legally unfounded because there's no proof, there's no UN approval, there's no third-party support to the claims. There has been mass atrocities in these areas. And the war theater would have to be strictly limited to these regions where the atrocities are demonstrated would have been demonstrably happening. Is this maintaining Donbass as a frozen new war region, using the identity mental to control mineral resources? Certainly a Russian puppet government in Kiev would have allowed this and guaranteed gas pipelines to Europe and energy dependency on Russia. Makes sense economically and politically, certainly illegal and immoral today. Is it an independence guarantee? I mean, just to go through some of the history, we cannot exclude the idea that a country may want to help another country achieve independence. I mean, even the Maltese fought. We sent 2,000 soldiers to fight in the Battle of Chesapeake Bay in the US during the US Independence War. Then a few days later became ourselves a colony of the British, but historical irony goes that way. Until 2004, the Orange Revolution, there was no significant support in Donbass for independence. Also because Yanukovych, who hails from Luhansk, and his Donbass clique they proved to Putin they could control Kiev. So, I mean, they had no intention of having independence if they could control Kiev. The transfer of Russia's Black Sea Fleet stalled because it was too expensive. So Russia had wanted to be sure that they weren't thrown out of the Crimean Peninsula. So even though Yanukovych was removed, he came back to power in an election declared free and fair by the West. So, and he immediately granted Russia cheap long-term basing and transit agreements. Then, a few years later, with the Euromaidan protests, he's thrown out and his clique is removed from power. So what happens is that Russian soldiers without insignia invade Crimea and the Donbass, pretending to be local fighters, and they convert the They convert the pro-Yanukovych protests into an independence movement. Russia annexes Crimea. Obviously, they get a guarantee now that nobody's going to take their bases from Sevastopol. Then it uses propaganda in regions controlled by its militia to foment fear of Western leading Kiev, and hence separatism, possibly seeking a land bridge to Crimea. But the problem is that Zelensky, being himself a Russian speaker from East Ukraine, he cannot fit within this propaganda because he cannot be portrayed as the oppressor from Kiev, from Ukrainian-speaking Uniate part of the country. He's a Jew. So again, the whole narrative explodes, and certainly Putin has a problem that his narrative of oppression by Kiev doesn't work anymore. So, I mean, those are some of the reasons we can attest. From an appraisal point of view, this is not a just war. There's no objectively just cause. Obviously, we cannot go into Putin's intentions. Violence is not being used, obviously, as a last resort against whatever grievances Russia may have against Ukraine. There's no decision by a legitimate authority because there's no declaration of war. There's no proportionate response to a triggering act, whatever the triggering act is supposed to be. And the violence being used by Russia is not being used defensively. On the jus in bello, certainly, I mean, most of those things on the Ukrainian side are valid. I think you can say all of them are valid. And also, for now, at this point of war, Ukraine can keep fighting because its warfare generally is in keeping with jus in bello. What can we do? This is my conclusion. Sorry for taking some of your time more than you may have expected. But I'd like to finish with a citation of Vatican II and something about pacifism. Peace is not merely an absence of war. It cannot be reduced solely to the maintenance of balance of power between enemies, nor can it be brought about by dictatorship. Instead, it is rightly and appropriately called an enterprise of justice. This is why we call the Commission Justice and Peace, and we put the word justice before peace, because in Catholic thinking, there's no peace which is not the just peace. You can call it something else, but not peace. This peace on earth cannot be obtained unless personal well-being is safeguarded and men freely and trustingly share with one another the riches of their inner spirits and their talents. A firm determination to respect other men and peoples and their dignity, as well as the studied practice of brotherhood, are absolutely necessary for the establishment of peace. Hence, peace is likewise the fruit of love, which goes beyond what justice can provide. We cannot fail to praise those who renounce the use of violence in the vindication of their rights, and who resort to methods of defense which are otherwise available to weaker parties, too. So, non-violent, think of Gandhi, Martin Luther King. Provided, however, this can be done without injury to the rights and duties of others or of the community itself. So there is a limit to this kind of pacifism within the Catholic tradition, at least in Vatican II. There are many types of Christian pacifism, some more moderate, some more radical. Radical pacifism entails not doing anything physical to protect the innocent from being raped, tortured, or killed. In the more radical versions, it means not even phoning the police, because it means that you're actually asking someone to use violence on your behalf. Obviously, it means not getting a foreign power involved if someone is invading you on the level of international law and international relations. Letting God deal with violence miraculously, or in the end of times, would be the solution of the radical pacifist. However, the more serious radical pacifists would say that this is a prophetical choice, and we're not taking the choice of Pilate of washing our hands. Rather, we are going to the war zones and exposing ourselves to physical risk and death to aid the victims and to engage in non-violent activism. So if you want to engage in this kind of pacifism seriously, you should go to Ukraine, or you should go to the Kremlin with a placard to protest against the war. That would be the real radical pacifism. Most of us, on the level of state, obviously that would be more of a personal choice. We would ask our states to involve, as regards new wars, in responsibility to protect. Certainly, Article 1.3 of the Maltese Constitution, I think legally it should allow Malta to live up to its moral responsibility to protect, together with the community of nations, the victims of mass atrocities. Certainly, a rigorous reading of the text may imply a lot of legal restrictions on what a Maltese government could do, but that should be a topic of a debate on how this could be hermeneutically reinterpreted or amended for a post-Cold War world. Finally, pacifism. I mean, this would be the traditional response. It is the old school pacifism, which would say we should seek to abolish interstate war using diplomatic means and sanctions as far as possible. However, there are situations where pacifism, traditional pacifism, accepts that use of force may be necessary to stop an aggressor who repeatedly threatens world peace by invading and destabilizing other policies. I mean, the classic example is Hitler. But the interventions must obey jus in bello rules. Finally, hard sanctions, they're not the golden bullet. I mean, they're not always morally better than open conflict. A classical case is the starving of Germany at the end of World War I. This has been considered by a lot of ethicists as something which was unacceptable because the target of the blockades by the British Navy and other allied countries, where the target was exactly to starve the civilian population and make the government to capitulate to their terms, instead of fighting the military as a military should be doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Father René, for a very interesting talk. Obviously, it's a very vast subject, and we just scraped the surface. But it's also a good introduction for us to reflect more on this topic, and hopefully whoever is interested to delve deeper into the various references you made. But now is the time to open the floor for some discussion, and we are also lucky to have with us a number of people, distinguished guests, who have experienced war in a particular way or another. I believe some of you have been in Bosnia and places you also mentioned during the war, actually. So some of you might want to share some of that experience, and you might also disagree with something Father René said, which is okay. We're here to discuss and to dialogue. But also, obviously, everyone is invited to comment or ask any questions or say whatever. I just remind you to keep it brief as much as possible and concise, so that as much as possible everyone could have the opportunity to participate. I see Mark,
Just a couple of comments. Not at all disagree with Father René. I think actually you've given a very good overview of the sort of problems that we're having to face now. But in fact, for instance, two or three things. The new war, this idea that war, and the politicians in the West have used this hugely. War is always going to be about dealing with criminals, with jihadists. So we need a different sort of army, or we need a different sort of police. So what do? There were countries in NATO, I gather, who are actually planning to scrap all their tanks. Then Putin comes along with his tanks. So there's always the lack of wisdom of preparing for the last war or preparing for, what you think a war is going to be like without thinking about the possibility that other things could happen as well. Yes, we have to deal with Islamic State, but we also now have to deal with Russia. And the snag is that if you don't invest beforehand, you then have this huge rush of watching in CNN, will the arms arrive in time, So there's the practicality of things, because of course defense budgets are expensive. What the other, and just looking at the almost tragic, precise, the prophecy about what you do, how we treated Ukraine, or how the terrorists treated Ukraine. Okay, don't worry, Ukraine will split. But actually, Czechoslovakia is easy to split because there were already two states which were amalgamated, and they both wanted to join the European Union. And the theory of the Union, well, yes, of course, the Western Ukraine is basically Uniate Catholic in large extent, but that's because Western Ukraine was actually part of Poland till the Second World War. So there's not an easy split. And in any case, there's the whole point that collectively the Ukrainians had opted to go, to join the European Union. But there are a few issues, however. One is, again, the risk of saying, well, we must get the Russians to go back to their positions before they started this war. Hang on, what about Crimea? When did at what point can you say that the Ukrainians have to stop fighting? And there is exactly, you can see what the Ukrainians are saying about that. They want to go back to the... And the other thing is, yes, it's true that, sadly, Ukraine, you've got this thing that the birth of Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus is the birth of Russia. And Ukraine as a nation was a construct which happened during the Soviet Union times, and not and you have that difficulty that it's quite difficult to find. But hence, the need to have, in fact it was beautiful, when you saw what actually happened in the Colosseum the other day, the wisdom of stopping, not having even a prayer, and just having these two women who are friends holding the cross. The message was actually perfect, because the problem is the people. The other thing is that I've got a lot of friends of mine here who have been in wars, and the reality is they've been in wars to intervene under the banner of the Red Cross to save lives. And they've done so, although they're part of an army. And so again, you have a whole level. You can't theoretically fight a war. At the end of the day, you have to be facing somebody and fighting. It's how you relate to that other person. And the fundamental thing right down is how do we relate to each other? And how do we relate in a fair way? And I suppose those are all of my comments.
Thank you. I'll just say one thing, because I'd like to hear some of you and make this more of a debate. So just, what you mentioned in the Colosseum was, the Pope insisted on this, and I think the way it was done was great. Certainly, I can understand some of the protests, but the problem is someone told me, I want to do like the Pope, so let's bring a Russian flag and an Ukrainian flag during an offering. And I said, no, because the flag represents nation states. Bringing people and flags are two different things. And there was the debate in Germany when last weekend, the Russians went out in Berlin and other cities waving Russian flags saying, look, we're being discriminated, people are treating us badly. Certainly, I mean, we shouldn't treat Russians badly, but going out to protest with the Russian flag, if you're German and if you're committed to the nation of Germany, you should go out with the German flag. And then with other symbols of Russian identity, which do not include the symbols of the Russian nation state. Because the whole debate is here that we can be Russian in Malta, and we should respect all of the Russians in Malta. But the problem which we have is not with Russians as people, but with, I mean, certainly in some way the state of Russia represents the body politic of the people who are citizens of Russia. But we should make some of these distinctions. And the body politic of the people, of the citizens of Russia, is not the Russian nation, the ethnic Russian nation, and that's not the Russian-speaking population of the world, which is yet another thing. So we should be careful about these distinctions.
Just one more comment on that, if I may, is that, of course, the Russians, some of the greatest victims of the war in Ukraine are the Russian conscripts, very badly led apparently, who have been sent there without being told why.
Yeah, they're cannon fodder, I mean.
Yeah, cannon fodder. And that's the entire...
Thank you. Sir Martin, you wanted...
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm Professor Martin Britton. I'm Professor of Conflict Health and Military Medicine based at King's College in London, and previously I was the Surgeon General of the UK Armed Forces. And I have a particular interest now on ethics, both in the use of military force and the role of medicine in support of armed forces. My particular question is the sort of counterpoint. I think we can universally agree that it's difficult to construct an ethical argument for the way in which Russia's chosen to use force. My question would be, what would be the ethical limits to the way in which Ukraine responds?
Yeah, I think there is, again, certainly we can have, I mean, the realists have an answer of this. So whereas the Russians can lie as much as they want, as soon as the Ukrainians are caught in a lie or caught doing something dirty, they're going to stop being treated as the goodies. So they have to be careful with their lying and with their use of military force. To be sure, we have military convention, we have Geneva Conventions and other, and even more recent. So the question, I mean, use of landmines is certainly a no, I think, in these, and use of cluster bombs. I think we hope that we've made at least some advances in these last few years as regards certain use of I mean, these are traditional things which have been used for centuries, but to make war more humane, certainly the way prisoners are treated. But there are issues also around the cyber warfare. So certainly there's another war happening through the internet. I mean, hackers could get into the Russian grid and eventually shut the lights of a whole city. People in hospitals without access to ventilators and so on. So there are these issues which, I mean, the whole use of hacktivism to support the warfare, and this brings us to a whole new area which is unexplored. There have been reports again of the use of hypersonic missiles. Again, should this technology be transferred to I mean, yeah, it seems that the Moskva was sunk using a traditional missile system, but certainly, I mean, with hypersonic missiles, you can sink the whole Black Sea fleet if you want. So certainly there are weapons systems which are being transferred to Ukraine which are very advanced. Up till a certain point, there's a lot of restraint, but now, especially after Bucha, I think a lot of that restraint has gone away. You have to be careful with what's going to happen with all of those weapon systems. Certainly, this will create an arms race. Certainly, China is watching. The other element here which has to be mentioned is how much is this going to cost to everyone? So certainly the prolongation of this war is creating famine in Africa, in countries who cannot afford to buy grain and other cereals, with the current prices in the world markets. Cost of fuel to transportation, it also has an impact on agriculture. So again, we have, even as we recover from a pandemic and from a long double recession, a lot of money which had been allotted for the reconstruction and for poor people is being diverted into support for Ukraine, but also into new weapons programs. So all of this has to be taken into account. I mean, this is very, very, very worrying, because not only people in Ukraine are suffering. I mean, this has a ballooning effect all over the world, and it will also cause new wars as more hardships are felt in some of the failed states and the weak states of the world. So if this war is prolonged, I mean, whoever wins, there's going to be other victims which we won't immediately connect to it, but would be there.
Military surgeon, with experience of helping victims in conflict. Think League of Nations, pre-World War II, and that became ineffective with the rise of Hitler. Think the United Nations now, with Russia, China, the top 5 in the Security Council. Zelensky, when he addressed the United Nations, said you may as well disband yourself with Russia or any one of the 5, but Russia currently holds a veto at the Security Council. If that one of those 5 countries is the aggressor and vetoes moves against itself, it emasculates the United Nations and the response. Can you comment on that, please, for the future of world policing and just policing? Thank you.
Certainly, yeah, the United Nations system with the Security Council structure is problematic at this point. I mean, the League of Nations, I mentioned pacificism, and that was the point. I mean, the idea of having perpetual peace has been in the works of philosophers dreaming about this since well, since Erasmus, basically, going to Kant and others. And it took shape after the First World War, which was called the war to end all wars. But I mean, the League of Nations did nothing when Italy invaded Ethiopia, because obviously, I mean, who cares about Ethiopia? And then they didn't intervene in Manchuria when the Japanese invaded a chaotic China, let's say. It was too costly, and nobody wanted to get into that mess, which was warlord China at the time. So, I mean, at this point, it was clear that the whole system wasn't really functioning. Today, we have the United Nations, which, I mean, it's effective on many accounts, but Russia and other nations are impossible to hold to account. And there is no easy other, I mean, when you have nuclear armed nations, who is going to hold them to account? So this is part of reality, but I think we can improve on the model which we have of the United Nations. I hope we don't have to dissolve the United Nations to create something without a Security Council in order for this to come to pass, because this is what they have to do with the League of Nations.
Perhaps we'll take a few comments and then so we have more time.
Just going to say I have a loud booming voice and I'm down without the microphone, but better with the microphone.
I can hear better.
Well, there's so many things I want to speak about, and I just got to collect myself now. Being 70 plus, I'm starting to lose track. I'm Peter McCulloch-Pinot, I'm a doctor now, and I'm connected as well in aviation medicine, and formerly in my former life, an army officer and pilot, and yes, and a very keen, very keen interest on history, and studied a little bit of theology, and so I've got a very keen interest on that. It's okay. So, where do we start? Firstly, I would like to spread this thing, and we stop calling it the Ukraine-Russia war. There are two things immediately that we should, I think, correct. It is not Russia that, in fact, has not declared war, that has invaded Ukraine. Of course, the Russian armed forces and all those who fought with it, but it's not Russia as a soul of the nation. And if you just go quickly to Kieran Rus, I always forget how the word is exactly, but I've heard of it before. And we know that this started in Kiev. In fact, Kiev was the cultural capital, not declared so, not politically so, but a cultural, ethnic. And to this very day, Russians move to Ukraine to study at Kiev. You know, it's one of those, as we might go to Cambridge or Oxford or something, or in fact the Gregorian University, okay, outside our own country. So really, so Rush, Red, they moved more, they migrated northwards, not all of them, but some did, and then they got quite honestly contaminated as well with other things there. So again, another of my thing is to call this Russia. Actually, it's a Russian Federation. It's not all Russia, so the Turkmenistan, or nowadays they're independent, or they sort of think, okay, Chechen, and all those sort of things. Then they consider them Russians. So all this business about the Ukraine and Russia being thing, yes, to a certain extent, certainly they're a lot closer. The Ukrainians and the Russians, you know, put it that way, the Red Russians, okay? Because of course there's Belarus, which really means white Russia, although nowadays it's as red as anything else. But it's a Belarus and that's a white Russian. So Ukraine can be looked on upon the white Russians. So in short, it's not in fact a fatherly, it's not a family squabble, and that sort of thing. And of course they share much in common, but they have also now much in division. And clearly so. And of course it's correctly, sorry, I'm combatant. Anyway, I heard that it said that Ukraine should have the right to choose its own future, not just because it is very much as, you know, English and German, Saxon, etc. Corrected ethnically, okay, and they come to Northern Britain. Anyway, enough of that. So, it's Putin, and therefore it is Putin removed, whichever way, but of course by Russians, certainly none of the silly thing of sending people in from outside. That is going to stop this. That's all. That's the way I say it. Putin only. And therefore we have to be very careful, sorry if I shout, we have to be very careful of not coming to any sort of negotiations or treaty or etc. with Putin. Right. Doesn't mean that we're not going to get someone Putin's done away with, quite frankly. You know, those around him say, you're far too, you're too much of a liability to Putin, go. That's it. Yeah. And they can put someone else worse than Putin in place. But nevertheless, psychologically, it is not a treaty with Putin. If it does so, then it in fact rewards him. It rewards him. You can always say, right, you know, we're doing piecemeal, we're doing step by step. We've got the Donbass area, we've got the whole corridor, the Ukraine, etc. The next thing, the other thing will wither away. Because the West will lose interest in the end, it will lose interest. So this was one thing I wanted to bring up, that it's Putin, and Putin to be removed in order to come to any sort of peace. Now peace, as, yeah, lovely to hear, justice first and then peace. The peace can only come through justice. So as far as possible, justice is to be done. Justice is to be done. And of course, the retribution, the correction of someone who has broken the peace, as the British police used to say, someone has broken the rules, which haven't been actually written, but since the Second World War it was taken that in Europe we're not going to have movements of one nation's force into another, then that has to be corrected by some sort of war crime tribunal, in fact, war crimes tribunal. But, okay, so we have this lying and truth. It's a couple of things I want to make a note of here. So the justice to be the basis of any sort of peace. Well, justice will bring peace, sorry, it's not the basis of peace. Justice will bring peace. Peace will come from anything about justice. And of course, justice will be based on truth. And then any reconciliation has got to become that the truth is recognized, whatever it is, one side, the other side, etc., and they then reconcile. So, war, again, needs to be defined properly, because, correctly said, you know, we've got not only tanks and things, we've got cyber warfare. I know very little about cyber warfare, but I do understand that this, that all that preceded in Ukraine was also a cyber attack. So in a certain way, Putin's aggression started with the cyber attack. So in all the discussion about this of war, and I'm taking Ukraine quite understandably, I mean, that's going on around them, all this discussion about war and pacifism and war and so on and so forth. And we've got a lovely example here. So this modern warfare, old warfare, actually it's a mishmash of both, you know, they're just all using, of course, that comes in psychology, which was used until the Second World War, even a bit in the First World War.
Can you kindly conclude?
Sorry?
Can you conclude?
Yes, I should conclude. So, again, there were a lot of points that I thought perhaps we could sometime define or come to a conclusion on, especially about the sort of Russian and Putin people, and truth, and truth as being for justice, that will give justice. When you recognize the truth, you can enact justice, and that will bring peace. So thank you. But sorry for this rambling.
Peter? You.
Thank you. I'm Peter Brinston. I'm a retired Surgeon Commander, Royal Navy, long retired. My question was one of ethical issues and how, in my lifetime, I'm 80 odd now, and ethics has changed in many ways. I have always believed that something was ethical or not, but in my lifetime I've seen ethics change. As an example, we have condemned roundly and rightly the bombing and shelling of Mariupol, for instance, and the killing of civilians. And then I take myself back 80 odd years or 78 years and see historically the mass bombing that we conducted on, for instance, Berlin, and how we committed the same atrocities ourselves as Christians and rational thinking people, and justified it, and yet we now, I believe rightly, roundly condemn what Russia were doing to Ukraine, and particularly places like Mariupol, and how you can reconcile that.
I don't know if there's someone else who wants to make a brief point. It seems that everyone is happy, so I'll leave the floor to you to conclude this session. And
okay, thank you. I expected more pacifists to rise up and say, like, I had a very, very pro-war position. I don't think I have a pro-war position, but obviously I grew up within a family here in Malta which does not have a military history, and in a society with without conscription, without any concern about being drafted. I got interested in some of these debates when I was in the US and had to deal with people who had fought in wars. And again, my more radical pacifism maybe was brought into contact with the reality of, okay, man, you can't just tell people don't do it. I mean, it happens, so you need to think about it. Okay, just to conclude, because I don't want to take too much time. One is, I didn't mention Putin in my presentation. I mean, I didn't want to make this an ad hominem kind of argument. Certainly a lot is riding on this one person. Certainly it's not easy to remove him. Some of the oligarchs say, well, I mean, don't punish us. We have no real power over this guy. He's keeping us in check. I mean, probably even the Russian Orthodox Church is subdued. I mean, this is, he has dirt about everyone and about everything. But, I mean, it's good to continue to speak also in terms of nation states. And certainly, there is at least a parliament, there are people, we've seen how he talks to his ministers like little children in a classroom, but this is the reality, and this is one of the most powerful nations in the world, or at least not necessarily the richest, and the economies of Russia, of the Russian Federation is maybe smaller than half of that of California, but it still has a huge nuclear arsenal, and the idea that it's still the second superpower. So that continues to feed the people's thinking. A lot of people, the support for Putin actually increased during this conflict. So I don't want simply to put the citizens out of the picture. Certainly, okay, there is all of the propaganda, all of the control of the media and everything, but these guys have internet, these guys have traveled, these guys have seen other places. So there can be regime change within Russia, but I wouldn't want to have it come from outside so easily, because it's a dangerous thing. I mean, certainly what we've seen in Libya is not something which we'd like to have elsewhere very easily. When I was in China, I did a China experience some years ago, and again, that's another situation, but some people were telling us that some of the younger people in the military and in politics, I mean, guys my age, they have this nostalgia of the Grand China, with the idea of China having been humiliated by the West long enough. Still on the history textbooks, I mean, it's in China you have these images of the Summer Palace destroyed by the armies of the Western nations. Interestingly, the Summer Palace was built by, was designed by Jesuit architects as a merger of Chinese and European architecture, and that kind of dialogue with Europe was destroyed by the European armies after the Opium Wars and so on. So still there you have generations, even in Russia, who are more nostalgic of this grandeur of the past. And we should work with trying to, I mean, certainly you have young people who are very European-minded in Russia, but sometimes there is this kind of schizophrenia. I mean, the same young people could be very European-minded when they're speaking in a certain context with certain people on certain topics, but they also have this idea that Russia has been humiliated and should regain its splendor in some way or another. And so, I mean, it's also an issue with the citizenry of Russia, not just with Putin. Though I understand that a lot of this problem is also due to this guy, but we've chosen to trust this guy because he has offered us stability for more than 20 years, and we prefer to have a stable Russia than the chaos which seemed to be in place in the 90s. So in some way we've strengthened his own position. Okay, something about justice and peace quickly. Certainly justice is a base of peace, as you said, but there's something in the value of love which goes beyond at least legal justice or commutative justice. So sometimes people have to make the first step and maybe even the second step and be slapped in the face a couple of times. Sometimes you can, by resisting the urge to fight back, you disarm the aggressor, because the aggressor too is human. Now this is complex. Again, you can read Gandhi and other authors on this. It doesn't work so easily. I mean, certainly Gandhi's tactics worked quite well in India because there's a disciplined army with at least a minimum of moral decency. Certainly the British did a lot of atrocities also in India, but he could expect that they wouldn't simply destroy. I mean, we've had that in Sette Junior here in Malta at some point, but we know that the people who were involved they were about to mutiny, and they were very unhappy to have been commanded to shoot on the crowd. So, I mean, that kind of nonviolence can work. I mean, another thing which is interesting is the use of satire, the use of humor, not satire. This has been used, for example, there's Sidra Popovic in Serbia, who, against Milosevic, there were this group of youths who basically showed that this horrible military of Milosevic, if they were ridiculed, sent around town, like going around in circles looking for something and looking ridiculous, people could see that they were not so frightening after all. They're just soldiers who are obeying orders out of fear. And sometimes that culture of fear can be blown away. I mean, there is a lot of psychology today which goes into thinking of how we can use pacific means to diffuse. Certainly we have fear, we have psychopaths which are not easy to touch their hearts, but a lot of people are not psychopaths, and I think love can in some cases bring us beyond simply a sense of justice which is just sort of an arithmetic of justice. Finally, the question of the German cities. I mean, certainly the bombing of civilian populations, I mean, it has been considered immoral, though even the Pope at some point, when he wanted to go back to Rome, when he had been pushed out by the Roman Revolution, the Roman Revolt, by the Roman Republic, he basically hinted to his generals that they might go ahead and bombard the civilian populations of Rome. So, I mean, the Italians then invented air bombing in their Libyan and African wars, and it was taken for granted for the first half of the 20th century that, I mean, though it was bad, it was unavoidable. Modern warfare couldn't really distinguish between the civilian population and military installations. Certainly here in Malta, our military installations are within the Grand Harbour. We're within the Grand Harbour, so in a very densely populated area. Some of the German cities, however, could have been spared. I think this has been, however, I mean, a progress that we can say, okay, we went back to a more rigorous understanding of jus in bello, but certainly morality has evolved, and hopefully for the better. Again, in many religions we don't have the idea of non-combatant immunity. I mean, this came from, we didn't have this for the first 1,000 years of Christianity. I mean, this was something which was developed from a religious movement in France. But now, I mean, I think the idea that we should avoid total war has certainly been enshrined in international law, and certainly the human rights regime have helped us go deeper into certain ethical issues and mature some of our thinking. Thank you everyone for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, Father René. And thanks to all of you for joining us, and a special thanks to the people also watching us from their homes through the online streaming, which will now end. However, for those of you who are present here, our discussions can continue over a few refreshments which will be served down in the beautiful garden there is here. So I encourage you, if you have some time, to spend a few more minutes with us, and we'll have some conversation together and try to keep this conversation going. Just a few adverts. Obviously, as a commission, we encourage you to follow our social media, our Facebook page, Justice and Peace Malta. We also have Twitter and Instagram. We have a website as well, jp.church.mt. Outside the room, there are a few copies of the document which we published at the beginning of this year, Yahad, which is our vision for unity and national reconciliation for our society. Feel free to take any copies. There are versions in Maltese and in English. We have also a few copies of the book Dying to Live, which we had an event last year. It's about the experiences of refugees who obviously leave their countries, and it's for sale. Whoever wants to buy a copy, just let us know. And we have only a few copies, we don't have a lot. So those are the parish parish news. So, and I invite you to move to the garden where we can informally continue our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.